Hello, my name is Bob Clips. I'm a member of the Ohio Moss and Lichen Association, and I'd like to share with you some information I've put together about liverworts, the other bryophytes. I saw a program a few months ago on Zoom, a nice botany talk, where the speaker wore a tie. I was very impressed with the tie. Not impressed enough to wear a tie, however, but I do have my LED hat, which I got when I started teaching during the early days of the pandemic. And it tells us right now that botany is best, which it is. And we're going to learn that liverworts are a kind of bryophyte. And we're going to start by learning about mosses. Now, this technology is working. Let's see if the other technology is going to work. So I go with share screen, book, and here's the PowerPoint. Nice. And we're going to start by looking at the plant kingdom and seeing what types of plants there are in the plant kingdom. And as you may know, the first types of plants to occur didn't have all of the attributes that are helpful for life on land. They didn't have vascular tissue, and they didn't have seeds. And these are the so-called non-vascular plants. Although it's not really great to define things by what they don't have, nonetheless, the mosses, hornworts, and liverworts are sometimes collectively called bryophytes. And they have in common a couple of things that have to do with the plant life cycle, which are a little bit Bio 101-y, for which I slightly apologize. Let's take a look at the plant life cycle and see what we mean when we talk about gametophytes and sporophytes, and why bryophytes are special because they have a dominant gametophyte. So this is a diagram of the plant life cycle. And plants have two stages in the life cycle, two things that you could point to and say, that's a plant. One of them is called the sporophyte, and that means spore plant. And the other one is the gametophyte, which means gamete plant or gamete producing plant and spore producing plant. Most plants, well, let's tell you what the life cycle stages do. Sporophytes are plants that have two sets of chromosomes in each of their cells, kind of like animals do. They are diploid. And somewhere on their body are produced spores, which are cells that have half the number of chromosomes. They're haploid. They have one set of chromosomes per cell. In this case, there's only one cell because they are spores. They develop into multicellular haploid organisms, something that you don't have in animals, but you do have in plants, also in fungi and algae, by the way. And they produce eggs and sperm that are called gametes, which fuse and develop into sporophytes. Here's a picture of the moss life cycle. Yes, I know this is a talk about liverworts, but mosses are a little bit more familiar, and frankly, I have more pictures of the moss life cycle than I do of the liverwort life cycle. And a lot of this is sort of intricacies that are especially pertinent for moss biology, but let's direct our attention to the stage that's called the gametophyte, is the dominant persistent stage of the life cycle. And there's another stage called the sporophyte, which in bryophytes, mosses, liverworts, and hornworts, is actually attached to the gametophyte. And for mosses, there are some special structures that are associated with the sporangium part of the sporophyte. Let's take a look at some of these, and then we can compare them to liverworts. So in mosses, the spore germinates first not to form a gametophyte. Well, technically it is the gametophyte, but it's not the leafy stage of the gametophyte. It's a thread-like stage called the protonema. Proto means before, nema means thread. Here's a picture of my favorite moss, Fiscomitrium pyriforme, fern moss, showing mostly the thread-like protonema and also some of the leafy leaves of the leafy stage of the gametophyte, the part we usually call the gametophyte. And someplace on the gametophyte, in this diagram drawing, at the tip of the stems, are produced, kind of by definition, gametes. So here's a picture of my favorite moss, ern moss, and this little circle of leaves in the center of it happen to be a lot of antheridia, little sacs where sperm are produced. And they are sacs where sperm are produced. The egg is produced in what looks like a bottle. It kind of is an egg in a bottle. It's called the archegonium. And here's a picture on the left showing my favorite moss, ern moss, Fiscometrium pyriforme, with the two branches. And the branch on the right, the larger one with the rosette of leaves, that's a male branch. And the one on the left, a little smaller, that happens to be a female branch. So this moss has both sexes on different branches of the same plant. And with the help of water in the environment, sperm swims from the antheridium to the archegonium. These are antheridia down in the lower right and an archegonium in the upper right. And fertilization takes place. And what results is what looks like an appendage, but is actually a separate stage, a separate plant, the offspring of the leafy gametophyte, and it's called the sporophyte. And in bryophytes, typically, there's some sort of supporting stalk, which might be really short, and there's one sporangium. It's another bryophyte feature that the sporophytes only have one sporangium. They are so-called monosporangiate. So here's a picture of mosses with fairly young sporophytes. This is ern moss, my favorite moss, in early spring. And then later in the spring, we'll have mature sporophytes with some accessory structures on the capsule. So here's a picture of a cluster of almost mature, and in one case, in the very, very far right, you can see one that has the lid called the operculum fallen off, and you can see the spores around the mouth of the capsule. And some of them have a hat called the calyptra, and all the others have their lid, the operculum, still tightly on them. And those are the sporophytes of ern moss. So here's some more moss sporophytes. They have a stalk called a seta, and they have a single sporangium, sometimes called a capsule because it's so prominent. Here's some of the structures of the sporangium capsule. There's a cap on the left, you can see it, called the calyptra. There's a lid, kind of like a garbage can lid that fits tightly around the mouth of the capsule called the operculum. And then when that falls off and spores are being distributed, there's the peristome, which literally means around the mouth. And it's often, usually, some sort of teeth that open and close with changes in humidity to regulate the dispersal of spores. So they can be pretty intricate for bryophytes, although they're not as persistent and as large as the gametophyte, which is why we say the gametophyte is the dominant stage in the bryophyte life cycle. Here's some fairly intricate sporangia with two circles of teeth. And just a little background in some common moss bryophytes. On the left, we have woodsy leafy moss, Plagionium cuspidatum. And on the upper right, we have broom moss, Dicranum scoparium. And in the lower middle, we have haircap moss, Polytrichum ohioense. And these three mosses are of the growth form that's called an acrocarp, meaning it has an upright stem, typically side by side, growing in maybe a cushion. And the sporophytes are produced at the very tips of the stems. These are called acrocarps. Another growth form is called a pleurocarp. And these tend to be branched and often spread like a carpet. These could be called carpet mosses, not cushion mosses, pleurocarps. In the upper portion, there's one that is called tree apron moss, Anomodon attenuatus. And lower left is one that kind of looks like a feather, and it's called brocade moss, Hypnum imponens. And in the lower right, there's one called fern moss, Thuidium delicatulum. But I haven't forgotten. The purpose of this information session is to learn about liverworts. I'll even change my hat to liverworts. So among the three phyla of bryophytes, mosses are the most numerous. There's about almost exactly 400 species in Ohio. Liverworts, not as carefully censused, but a good estimate is about 170 species in Ohio. And hornworts, there's only 3, of which 2 are common and 1 is really rare. The first surprise about liverworts is most of them don't look like livers. Liverworts are named for the resemblance to a liver, the old doctrine of signatures that said a plant looks like a part of the body that it can cure ailments of. And that is true for some liverworts, the so-called thalloid liverworts. But most of them actually are leafy and could be mistaken for mosses. But we'll look at some differences right away. So here's some pictures of some liverworts. In the upper left is a common one called snakeskin liverwort, Conicephalum conicum, or salabrosum, or whatever it should be properly called, or they should be properly called. And the other ones are leafy liverworts that look sort of like mosses, but sort of different. So here's a table that I made that compares the 3 phyla of bryophytes. And in terms of their growth form, liverworts, as we just mentioned, can either be thalloid with an undifferentiated sort of strap-like or tongue-shaped body, or leafy. Mosses are always leafy, and hornworts, that small group, is always thalloid. Symmetry. The symmetry of liverworts is bilateral as compared with mosses, which are mostly radial. In other words, the leaves go around the stem in a spiral fashion. And the bilateral part of liverworts, a little more description, would be to point out that what they typically consist of is 2 rows of leaves that are on either side of a stem that lays flat or is upright, but on either side of the stem, lateral rows of leaves, 180 degrees across from each other, and then an underleaf row, a row of smaller leaves that's on the lower part of the stem, which is often but not always present. The sporophytes of liverworts, nowhere near as complex as those of mosses. Rather than having a persistent stalk or seta, the liverwort set is sort of thin and translucent and very short-lived. And the capsule, instead of having operculum and calyptra and peristome and being sort of fairly long-lived, splits into 4 sections, and the whole thing collapses. I think it lasts a day or 2 or 3. Hornworts, as appropriate for the name, have a horn-like shaped sporophyte, about which a little more later at the very end of our presentation. The cells through the microscope offer some clues about liverworts, hornworts, and mosses. And liverworts have a bunch of chloroplasts like most plant cells do, although hornworts only have 1 single chloroplast, a big chloroplast per cell, I am told. I'd like to see that, haven't yet. But another thing that liverworts have that neither the other 2 phyla have are oil bodies. These are sort of typically larger than chloroplast organelles, the function of which isn't very well known. But one thing about them is that the oil bodies are helpful in identification. They are. So here's a picture of a liverwort, one of several very difficult to tell apart, especially without some sexual characteristics, of leafy liverworts with unlobed and untoothed leaves. And it shows an inset of what it looks like through the microscope, showing 2 to 4 kind of granular, pretty large oil bodies. And that is a useful liverwort diagnostic trait. Here's some pictures of more liverworts showing, well, there's Plagiocula up above with many small oil bodies. There's a Lophosia with fewer, somewhat larger oil bodies. And on the right, there's Radula with only 1 really large oil body per cell. So we're going to look at liverworts categorized in some sort of artificial but useful ways by growth form and a few other features. So a useful book is this one by Mary Lincoln. It's published by the New York Botanical Garden. And it has in the cover and also in the table of contents this useful way of characterizing liverworts into groups to help us identify them. So let's take a look at these groups. And these are the groups that are going to be used in this presentation to share with you some common Ohio and elsewhere liverworts. So first off, Mary Lincoln shows us hornworts, about which we'll learn a bit at the very end, and then directs our attention to thalloid liverworts. These are the ones that don't have leaves. They have an undifferentiated sort of strap-shaped or tongue-like body that looks like a liver. Some of them are what are called complex thalloid liverworts, and these have tissues that are fairly thick, many cells thick, with air chambers within which there are photosynthetic cells and pores at the top of the air chambers. They also typically have elevated receptacles. And what we mean by receptacles, this picture on the upper right might suggest a gametophyte on the bottom with a sporophyte standing up from what we've seen so far. That's not exactly what it is. Everything you see here, except maybe a little bit sticking out at the top, is gametophyte. This upright structure is what's called a gametangiophore. It's where eggs are produced under the surface of that mushroomy cap. And that's where the spore fertilization takes place and the sporophytes develop. So the sporophytes are actually tucked under the umbrella-like top of this stalk, which is also sometimes called a receptacle. There's another group of liverworts that are complex thalloid liverworts, but they don't have an elevated gametangiophore / receptacle. They have buried capsules that disperse the spores when the liverworts disintegrate. These are aquatic ones that grow at the edge of ponds. We also have a group that can't make up its mind if it's leafy or thalloid, called leafy thalloid liverworts, that are in this genus called Fossambronia, although taxonomically they're very much a member of the leafy group, not the thalloid group. They just don't have very well-developed leaves. And then the leafy liverworts. Some of them have leaves that are finely dissected, which is another difference between liverworts and mosses. Moss leaves, almost all, except for a really odd one or two that occur elsewhere in the world. Essentially, all moss leaves are comparatively simple affairs. They're never lobed, and they can be toothed, but and they typically won't be very intricately folded. Contrary-wise, some liverwort leaves can be very deeply lobed or shallowly lobed, and even sometimes broken into little feathery divisions, and sometimes folded. So they have much more, what they lack in their intricacy of their sporophytes, they more than make up for the intricacy of their gametophyte leaves. So we have some with feathery leaves. We have some lower middle that are called complicate bilobed. And for complicate bilobed, what that means is the leaves are lobed and kind of like a mitten. They have the lobes facing each other, and one is larger than the other. And some of them are like if you're holding your hand like this, with the fingers on top, with the larger lobe on top, and others are like you're holding your palm out, but the thumb is on top, with the larger lobe on the bottom. And that is the complicate bilobed ones. Then we have leaves that are entire, they're not lobed, and there's something about the way that leaves are inserted. And there are two principal ways, incubus and succubus. And to tell them apart, think of what we're talking about here is like, I think of a Venetian blind and how the slats of a Venetian blind can be slanted so that the edge that's facing you is down, or the edge that's facing you is up. And that difference between them is the difference between incubus and succubus, Venetian blind analogy. So here's the dictionary definition of incubus. It's of leaves being so arranged that the anterior margin of each overlaps the posterior margin of the next younger, which is kind of complicated. Uh, what I like to do to interpret incubus versus succubus is, for example, with the incubus one, look at it from above like we are in this picture, and imagine a raindrop falling on the leaf from above. Which way will it flow? When it hits the leaf, I think you can see that this imaginary raindrop would flow backwards towards the left, towards the base of the plant. So that is one way of sort of distinguishing incubus without complicated definitions. Oh, about definitions and spelling, be very careful when you spell incubus to spell it B-O-U-S at the end instead of just B-U-S, because incubus is a totally different word. It's an evil spirit that lies on persons in their sleep, and that's totally not what liverworts do. Liverworts that are succubus, imagine your imaginary raindrop falling on this plant, it would flow towards the tip. And these two types of liverwort insertions can have leaves that are toothed or lobed or entire. Finally, let the sun shine in. You can have your Venetian blinds with the slats that are parallel to the floor so that you have them modeled. That's called a transverse insertion. So let's take a look at some liverworts. Let's start with the one liverwort that most people would know if they only know one liverwort, and this is common liverwort, Marchantia polymorpha. And the reason that it's so well known is that it's the one that occurs in most biology textbooks because it's cosmopolitan and tends to grow as a weed in greenhouses and other places. And so it's available typically to biology instructors who are also biology textbook authors. In this liverwort, both Antheridia, the sperm-producing Antheridia, and the egg-producing Archegonia, and later the sporophytes, are produced on elevated structures. And you can see here that there are two different types of elevated structures. The ones that are merely scalloped, and I wish I could point with this PowerPoint thing, but the ability to do that just seems to have disappeared. Oh, wait, no, it came back. I can draw, sort of. The one I'm circling now, that's not really a circle, is the male receptacle. And the ones that are very, very deeply lobed, which they're more prominent here in this picture, those are the female receptacles where the sporophytes are ultimately produced, tucked in under those arms. They look like little palm trees. They're cute. Another thing about Marchantia polymorpha is that it reproduces also by producing gemmy. This is asexual reproduction. So these cups that look like little birds' nests have in them what look like little birds' eggs. Those are gemmy. Those are multicellular bodies that can fly out of those when they get hit by a raindrop and form new plants all by themselves. It's a type of cloning, a type of asexual vegetative reproduction. So Marchantia polymorpha, a common species, is ecologically pretty widespread, and it grows sometimes on campfires, burn sites. It's one of the organisms that occur after forest fires. And here it is as a weed in, well, our flower pots where the proprietor was attempting to sell orchids, but I was more interested in it because of the Marchantia. Here's a different species of the same genus. This is called Marchantia quadrata. This is a comparatively rare, strictly calciphile, limestone-loving Marchantia that grows in southern Ohio on limestone and elsewhere on limestone. So here's a close-up of the receptacle of this Marchantia quadrata, showing those big fuzzy black balls that you can see two of. Those are the capsules of, I guess there would be perhaps up to 4 sporophytes. They're kind of upside down and with a very short stalk, but they have a big, comparatively large sporangium. And look how fuzzy they look. The reason they look so fuzzy, look in the lower right, we see not only 4 spores there, but there's these snake-like cells that are a special liverwort thing that are called elaters. Elaters. I'm elated to tell you about these elongate cells with spiral thickenings that spring open and twist with changes in humidity and are believed to help release the spores from the capsule. Elaters. That's a liverwort thing. There's something also called elaters that are very similar on the spores of horsetails. It's same name, similar function, but not homologous at all. Here's another complex thalloid liverwort with elevated receptacles. This is purple-fringed liverwort, Rebulia hemispherica, and it is also a calciphile, but not as strict a one as the Mercantia quadrata. And it has only the female receptacles. The two that are shown here, you can see green, smooth sporophytes just tucking out from the margins of these receptacles. But the males are actually not in receptacles. They're antheridia that are clustered together in little pads about a centimeter or less, a few millimeters behind the stalk of the female receptacles. Wish I could point, but look at the one on the right, the female one, and then go to the left a little bit, and there's a reddish mound there. That's where the male antheridia are. Here's another thalloid liverwort. It's called delicate starwort, Asterella tenella. It's smaller than the Marcantias and the Rebulia, and this one was growing on soil in a wetland prairie restoration. So here's perhaps one of the most well-recognized and commonly found liverworts. It's snakeskin liverwort in the genus Conocephalum, and it's got really big geometric shaped air chambers with prominent pores in them. Here's Conocephalum in the sporophyte producing stage. Here are some of the complex thalloid liverworts with, backtrack. I want to tell you something about Conocephalum. It's interesting because it's fragrant. If you find a place where this Conocephalum is abundant, break off a little piece and scratch and sniff it. It's got a kind of odd aroma that doesn't smell like anything exactly, kind of citrusy, sort of like grapefruit. But exactly what it smells like, hard to describe, but it's not unpleasant, very pungent. Little scratch and sniff would be a enlightening thing to do if you see a large patch of Conocephalum. And you're likely to see a large patch because it's very, very abundant on damp, shady rocks, especially sandstone, but also limestone. So here are the complex thalloid liverworts with buried capsules. And these are two aquatic genera. And this is Rhiziocarpus natans. Rhiziocarpus natans, when it's floating, forms some really thick partial rosettes with dichotomous branching. Here's a picture of it. Rhiziocarpus natans, like its cousin, I don't know, Rhizia, often also grows stranded at the margins of ponds, especially late in the summer. And here's Rhiziocarpus natans stranded. Here's a close-up of it, stranded. Takes on a little more thin, a little more branched form. Rhizia fluitans, which is called floating crystalwort, is kind of reminiscent of some kind of duckweed. It's a popular aquarium plant, so that if you say Google crystalwort, you can actually buy the stuff. And Rhizia fluitans, like Rhiziocarpus, becomes stranded at the mud at the edge of the pond and grows kind of more densely. So now let's take a look at simple thalloid liverworts. And these are one or a few cells thick, and they don't have those air chambers that the complex thalloid liverworts have. And they also have sporophytes that spring forth directly from archegonia on the thallus surface. They have more typical, evident, short-lived liverwort sporophytes. So this is ribbonwort, Palavicinia lyellii, and it's sort of tongue-shaped and has a fairly prominent midrib. The ones that are shown here with these little clusters of hair-like appendages in little bundles, this is a female plant, and that's surrounding the archegonia. This is a male plant with frilly ridges along the midveins. And I imagine there's sperm-producing antheridia in there somewhere, but I don't know the details. So this picture is kind of hard to look at, but this is a vertical sandstone ledge in southern Ohio. And what's growing here is a liverwort called Metzgeria furcata. Metzgeria is very light colored, very thin, branched an awful lot, very strap shaped. Here's Metzgeria furcata, forked veilwort, through the microscope. And you can deduce, I think, that it's one cell thick. It's got little hairs along the margin. And about in the lower part of the main branch there, you can see this little bubble-like extension. This is how this reproduces principally. It buds off little gemmy. It's very common to have gemmy on this species, and that's how you can recognize it, and that's how it reproduces. This is a different veilwort. This is Metzgeria conjugata, which doesn't produce gemmy, and I am told often produces bryophytes. So here's another really, really common liverwort that you're likely to see in any outing to damp, shady rocks in woodland situations, especially acidic ones like sandstone. And this is called Pellia epiphylla, and it's growing here, by the way, with a thalloid liver. Excuse me, it's growing here with a leafy liverwort. But let's direct our attention to the Pellia. So here's common Pellia with some sporophytes. And these are typical liverwort sporophytes with a sort of translucent, not very rigid seta, and kind of looks like a olive supported by a toothpick. And the olive, of course, is a sporangium. And when it produces sporophytes, boy, it produces a lot of them. And it looks like a little lawn grass. And it does so in early spring. This is, I believe, mid-April. I'm sorry, March. And it's showing here a lot of already dehisced, split open sporangia. Here's a picture that shows a close-up of sporangia, some of which have opened, and you can see, move me out of the way. There. You can see the 4 valves that it splits into. And also, you can see that little frilliness, that little fuzziness, which I believe is remnants of those elaters that help disperse the spores. And the other thing is that you can see these unopened sporangia that are comparatively simple affairs, just thin, no other structures. So here's a liverwort that isn't an Ohio liverwort, but it's one that has an interesting story, I guess. The story is people don't notice liverworts. So for some family medical care, we've had the opportunity or the obligation / opportunity to go to Philadelphia, which is a lovely city where there is this park that's called Wissahickon. It's everything in Pennsylvania is too many syllables, I think. Wissahickon Valley Park. And it's been described accurately, I believe, as the most beautiful and wild urban park in the world. And it is. It's a very large, very lovely park that's in Western Philadelphia. And there's this structure there that's called Philadelphia's first drinking fountain. And it explains that back in 1854, when this fountain was built for travelers, it flowed with clean, natural spring water. The inscription on the fountain promised, "For the public good, let it remain forever," and explains that forever lasted just 103 years. By 1957, the water became too polluted and they had to seal up the fountain. Boo. Well, when I was visiting their park with my friend, who we walked along the path and saw this fountain. And just to the left of the fountain, in this wall of rock that is very, very seepy and wet, there's a patch of this liverwort, which is called jagged germanderwort. It's a species of Riccardia camandriifolia. And this is a really big patch of a fairly robust liverwort. I mean, to a bryologist, this is really conspicuous. This is up there with, like, how a bird watcher might see a bald eagle nest with bald eagles with sticks in their mouths and crows diving at them. That's how noticeable this liverwort is. Well, that might be a bit of an overstatement, but here's a close-up of this Ricardia camidriifolia. It's not something you would be likely to miss, I don't think. Well, the naturalist aggregating and crowdsourcing wonderful utility called iNaturalist is a good place to look for and to add natural history observations. And so I took a picture of the jagged germander wort this spring and posted it on iNaturalist. And it turns out that, lo, this is the only observation in iNaturalist of this germander wort in the Philadelphia area. So you might think, okay, well, maybe this isn't a place where there are a lot of observations. Maybe the Wissahickon Park isn't frequented by iNaturalist users. Not so. Apparently, there are 29,963 different observations on iNaturalist, only one of which is this liverwort. So I guess people don't notice liverworts, at least maybe not iNaturalist users. Another way to learn about natural history observations is a more specimen-based tabulation system. And there's this wonderful entity that's called the Consortium of North American Bryophyte Herbaria. And this is what is generally called a symbiota portal. They occur for many other different types of organisms in addition to bryophytes, such as lichens and vascular plants and birds and fungi and stuff. And these are based upon specimens that are in this case, herbaria, in collections, in universities and museums. So you can search the portal, and if you search the portal for Ricardia in Philadelphia, there aren't very many records. There's 6 of them, of which one of them is my record from this spring. And if you look at the table here of the results for Ricardia in Philadelphia on the portal of specimens, it seems as though all of them are from the Wissahickon Creek area. And one of them, the most recent one, other than 2022, is 1959, just a couple of years after they closed up the fountain. And it's right there. The locality is the Pro Bono Publico Fountain at Wissahickon Creek. So it's the exact same spot. This liverwort's been hanging out there all this time, and people don't seem to notice them as much as they do other things. So one of the nice things about liverworts is you can make substantial contributions by becoming aware of these little guys. So another simple thalloid liverwort that's not very common in Ohio, but it's called common kettlewort, is Blazia pusilla. And in this picture, we see these little swellings. I believe these are flask-like swellings within which gemmae are produced. But something that I just learned about Blazia, I learned about it in a online course about hornworts. And the reason it came up was because Blazia, like almost no other plants except hornworts, Blazia has an association, a symbiosis with blue-green bacteria, cyanobacteria. Nitrogen-fixing cyanobacteria exist in colonies in the tissues of common kettlewort, helping it fix nitrogen, which is a very, very rare symbiosis that occurs in our area, at least, nowhere else in the plant kingdom, except in hornworts. And hornworts, the other bryophytes, all have blue-green bacterial symbioses. Who knew? So let's take a look at leafy liverworts with feathery leaves. And here's one. It's called tree fringewort, Thallidium pulcherrimum. And you can see these really deeply, intricately lobed feathery leaves. And it's a very pretty liverwort. Here's one that's, in my opinion, even prettier. This is handsome woolly wort, Trichocolia tomentella. And it looks so fuzzy. It's just so soft. You just want to pet it. I think this is the golden retriever of liverworts. And its leaves are so finely dissected and divided that it's basically all just dissected divisions. This is Trichocolia's leaves through the microscope. Okay, so now let's look at some liverworts that have toothed leaves and an incubus insertion. And this is a very, very prominently well-known, widely distributed liverwort called Byzania trilobita, three-lobed whipwort. And looking at this and using that mental tool, imagine a raindrop falling on this. Which way will the water flow? And I think you can see it would flow backwards towards the base of the stem because it has an incubus insertion. Byzania. Byzania is common in coniferous forests, such as hemlock and spruce further north. We don't have that in Ohio, but we have hemlock. And also on rocks in mixed woodlands. It sometimes has these root-like, because they're not vascular plants, but these attachment structures, these little rhizoids. And this is Byzania. Here's a picture showing that row of underleaves mentioned earlier. So again, the symmetry of leafy liverworts, they have typically two rows of leaves on the left and on the right sides projecting right across from each other, and often a single row of smaller underleaves. And this picture is showing you the undersurface, showing the underleaves, three of them. Okay, here's one that apparently has an incubus insertion. That's how it's classified in Mary Lincoln's book. And this is one of the problems about my photography is the scale. You can't really tell by looking at this. This is really tiny. This is full frame at 1:1 with a micro four thirds sensor. So it's like half of 35 millimeters. And I guess it's about 3/4 of an inch, this whole scene. And this is called wood fingerwort. Teeny guy. And through the microscope, it has very deeply lobed leaves. It's a little difficult to actually deduce the insertion type, but it's a very distinctive liverwort, Kerzia sylvatica. So here's a genus that's fairly easy to recognize using these characteristics that we talked about, because Callipygia is our only liverwort genus that has entire leaves, neither lobed nor toothed, and an incubus insertion. I should restate, neither toothed nor lobed nor complicate bilobed. The kind of trick with this, as we'll see soon, is that sometimes liverworts that have complicate bilobed leaves with the lower lobe smaller, it's hard to tell from above because you don't see the lower lobe. But this one, if you took a little look at the undersurface, you'd see these are strictly entire leaves. This is a species that often reproduces asexually by producing these upright branches with reduced leaves in clusters of one-celled, I think they're one-celled, gemmy at the tips in a little capitate cluster. Here's a leafy liverwort with toothed leaves and a succubus insertion. This is greater featherwort, Plagiocula, and this picture is meant to be a little tricky. I wish I had a pointer because I would take pains to show you that most of what's in this picture is not a liverwort. Well, it's about half and half. I like instances where organisms with a fairly similar overall growth form that aren't closely related grow together. And this is an example of that. This is a moss. There is in this picture a moss called Physidins, which is very feather-like, that unlike most mosses, which are radially symmetric, spirally arranged, has two rows of leaves on either side. Growing with it in the center with the pleated leaves that look sort of like chaps. That's the liverwort. That's the Plagiocula. Here's a picture of just the Plagiocula. And here it is through the microscope. I don't think it has underleaves, but it has a succubus insertion and that nice pleated look. Here's a picture of its cells through the microscope, showing some oil bodies. So here's a super common leafy liverwort. It's called variable crestwort, Lophicolia heterophylla. And its leaves are broadly lobed at the tip and at two lobes, sometimes more shallowly. And it typically grows on logs without bark on them. Here's a tiny, tiny liverwort. It's a member of the genus Cephalosea, and there's a related genus called Cephalosiella. And these are very, very small. Here it is through the microscope even. And you can see it has rhizoids that attach it to the substrate, but they're not roots. These are sometimes helpful in identification. And this genus sometimes occurs in dense patches in and of itself, and sometimes occurs as little strands among other bryophytes, Cephalosia. So here's one of several of these liverworts that are distinguished by, or difficult to distinguish, because they have entire leaves and a succubus insertion and no underleaves. There are several genera and a lot of taxonomic confusion. And the best way to tell them apart is by having some sexual structures that happen to be remnants of where the sporophytes came out. They're called perianths, that the books say are frequently present. Yeah, right. The check's in the mail. No, they're not frequently present. They're frequently absent. And you can scratch your head and say, maybe it's, and then list off a bunch of different genera. Here's another picture of one of those. This is called Odontoschisma sphagni. And here's one called Odontos, and here's, this is mislabeled. This is not sphagni. I just copied and pasted. This is Odontoschisma denudatum. And what's cool about this one is it kind of looks like that Calibragia mulleriana, upright little branches with gemmy at the tips. Here's a close-up, and it's similarly still mislabeled, and showing the gemmy and showing the succubus leaves. Here's one of the most abundant and frequently seen liverworts, but maybe not recognized. It's called woodrest pincerwort, Noelia curvifolia. And what's special about Noelia curvifolia is that it's tiny. It has a transverse insertion, which might not be obvious because it's so small. What's fun about it, though, is that its leaves are deeply concave, and it's been likened to a boat, a sailing boat with billowed sails. So when we see Noelia, we imagine we're looking at a regatta, a big boat race, a sailboat race with all these little boats with these billowed sails and the strong wind. This is what Noelia typically presents itself as, a very dense and large green covering on logs. And you have to get really, really close, put your nose against the log and use your hand lens to see Noelia curvifolia. And here's Noelia growing with its friend, the Lophicolia heterophylla. Okay, here's what I think would be, at least in Ohio, the most frequently seen but not recognized as such liverwort, because it doesn't really look like doesn't look like a liver, that's for sure. And it's not something that you're likely to look at very carefully. This is Frulania eboricensis. It happens to be a leafy liverwort with complicate bilobed leaves with the larger lobe on top. Fine. It looks like little target or spiderwebby anastomosing patch on deciduous trees. Can be very, very abundant. And it's something that you might walk past and see and kind of like the pattern, but not reflect upon what it is. Maybe think it's a moss, but it turns out it's a leafy liverwort, a very, very abundant one. It's called Frulania eboricensis. It's so common that sometimes it's called Frulania eboricensis. Here it is close up. And here it is through the microscope. And it's not eboring at all, because look, this is a picture that shows the lower leaves and the which are smaller, and the upper leaves are in the background. And they're not simply, I totally misspoke. This is a picture that shows the lower lobe of the complicate bilobe leaves and the upper lobe, which is larger, in the background. And there are underleaves too, but they're hard to see in this picture. But the thing is that the lower lobe, instead of being flat and leafy, it's fabricated into this hollow hood-like pitcher. And that's a Frulania thing. It's really cool. And sometimes little animals live in these pitchers. This is a rotifer, which is a multicellular animal, intricate but small, with its little rotors sticking out, spinning and bringing water to itself so it can eat bacteria and such. Yeah, Frulania eboricensis, New York scalewort. So this is a picture that shows one of the ways that you can distinguish liverworts. And there in the center, at the end of that branch, is what looks kind of like a disc, a little heart-shaped thing that doesn't look like the leaves. This is a useful identification feature and perhaps the most poorly named structure in all of botany. This is called the perianth. And what it is it's where the sporophytes emerged or will emerge, but they're short-lived and you often don't see sporophytes. So the archegonia are down there and the sporophyte comes out of this perianth and they're short-lived and don't have a lot of distinguishing features anyway. But since these perianths that house the archegonia and from which the sporophytes emerge are persistent, and variable, they're useful in identification. When they're present, it's great. Perianth, what a bad name. Why? Well, first of all, that's a flowering plant term, and it means the calyx and the corolla of a flower. It's basically the showy parts of a flower. And the name means around the anthers, around the male part, where on flowers there's pollen, which is totally not what it is in the liverwort because it's actually surrounding the female part. So perianth, it's a flower part and it's not a flower, and it's named for being around the male parts, and it's not that either. Perianth. Here's another species of scalewort. It's Philania azagreana, named after the great American early botanist Asa Gray. And through the microscope, this is a good one. It has a nice tell. It has this chain of thicker walled cells that are extending from the base of the leaf. It kind of looks like a midvein, which is something that these leaves don't have, that liverwort leaves don't have. It's called, these are called ocelli. And it's a very nice feature for distinguishing an otherwise pretty similar Frulenia through the microscope. Here's a liverwort that's related to Frulenia. It's called Jubula. And its leaves aren't quite, they're complicate bilobed, as you can see, but they're not formed into hoods. This picture shows the underleaves, very prominent. So here we have leafy liverworts with complicate bilobed leaves with the larger lobe on top. And this one is called Radula complanata. And looking at this from the top, you really can't tell that it's complicate bilobed. You can't tell that there's a lower lobe, that it's not a flat leaf. So quick glance, it could be a Calipagia. A little close-up look shows an interesting feature, which is gemmy along the front margin of the liverwort. Nice. And here it is through the microscope, showing, yes, indeed, the leaves are folded, and there's a lower lobe that we're seeing from our point of view. And you can also see the gemmy. So this is radula through the microscope with gemmy, complicate bilobed. Here's a tiny, tiny liverwort that, again, this scene is about 1/2 inch across, and it's called Biddlecombe's pouncewort, Coleogenia biddlecomii. It's tiny, and it would be difficult to distinguish it as being complicate bilobed without a discerning look through a microscope, but it's so small. I like Biddlecombe's pouncewort for another reason, because of who it's named after, an Ohio botanist of the early 20th century. And here's a little blurb from a report from Ohio State University from about 100 years ago. It was now brought to the attention of the board that a bequest of 10 shares of 8% preferred stock of the Ohio Finance Company had been made to the university under the will of Miss Hannah J. Biddlecombe, a former resident of Columbus. The will stipulates that the income from this stock should be made available for the use of the Department of Botany of the university. The board therefore accepts with appreciation this gift of stock and approve the use of blah, blah, blah. This is cool. Hannah J. Biddlecombe has a liverwort named after her and left money to the university. So there's an endowment that is named for a liverwort. Nice. Here's Biddlecombe's pouncewort through the microscope. So here's a fairly common leafy liverwort. It's called Porella. Well, here is in Columbus's historic Green Lawn Cemetery is a structure, a monument built out of whatever it's built out of, which is the worst thing to build, what you mean to be a monument to live in perpetuity, to be immortal, to be long lasting, of any material to make monuments out of, because it seems to be decaying. What is this made out of? Sugar? Uh, Whatever it's made out of, it's a really good substrate for this, Porella platyphylla, or probably Porella platyphyloidea. And this is a leafy liverwort with complicated bilobed leaves with a smaller lobe on the bottom. Here's a prettier picture of Porella growing on a tree in a calcareous woodland. And the undersurface of Porella is really striking. Not only is it complicated bilobed, but it has really big underleaves, and the leaves are decurrent with the little bases moving along the stem. It's such a convoluted and intricate affair. It reminds me of something that M.C. Escher, the artist M.C. Escher, would conjure up. There's a different species of Porella. It's kind of an aquatic one. This is on a tree in a swamp. It's called pinnate scalewort, Porella pinnata. It's more widely branched. Here's a picture of it. So now let's look at leafy liverworts with complicated bilobed leaves. This is almost our last category. I think there might be one other. With a smaller lobe on top. And the liverwort that's the subject of this picture is not the one that's most conspicuous. On the top, we have Byzania trilobita. But the base here that it's growing on is a liverwort called Scapania. Scapania has complicated bilobed leaves, like a mitten, but your palm is outstretched with the thumb on top. And that's a fairly common liverwort, Scapania nemorea or nemorosa. Here it is with sporophytes. You can see the split into the 4 valves. You can see the very slender stalk. You can see the unopened ones. And Scapania, like many liverworts, not only produces sporophytes, but reproduces by producing gemmy, and these little brown puffs at the tips of the branches. These are at the tips of the leaves. I'm not sure exactly where they're born, but these are gemmy. Here's a stream in southern Ohio where it grows an aquatic Scapania called Scapania undulata. It's got more widely spaced leaves. So here's another liverwort that's kind of similar to Scapania. It's called sharp-pointed earwort, Diplophilum apiculatum. And it's a little smaller, but more prominently, it's got sharper lobed leaves, and the upper lobe tends to project sideways a little bit instead of forward. Here's a comparison of the Scapania on the left and the Diplophilum on the right. So there we have it for most of the leafy liverworts. There's one more group that's called the leafy thalloid liverworts. And these are the ones that can't seem to make up their mind if they're leafy or thalloid, but they're definitely leafy in the sense of not having elevated structures that the gametangia are produced in. These sporophytes are just typical liverwort sporophytes, short-lived, simple sporangia, and this is called Fossambronia. Fossambronia grows in disturbed situations. I think it's an annual, and there's a few species, and they're distinguished by details of the spore, the ornamentations of the spores. And there's a picture showing it taking a ride on a elater. So that's it for liverworts. Let's take a look at, maybe I can change my hat. Do I have a hornwort? Good. Hornworts, of which there are not very many in the world. It's a small phylum, estimated maybe 300. They're mainly tropical, and they grow a few species this far north. Even though they're native plants, they tend to grow in some disturbed places, such as, I'll show you. This Phaeoceras carolinianus, is growing on a gas line right-of-way, newly excavated path through forest, where a gas line was buried, and on the bare soil is where this hornwort grows. So the thing about hornworts is the gametophyte is sort of irregular and thalloid, kind of like a thalloid liverwort. As mentioned, the sporophytes are horn-shaped. They dehisce by splitting open at the tip. They split apart when they get mature, and sometimes the spore color is diagnostic. The yellow spores in here tell you it's Theoceras. The sporophytes also grow in a manner that's unusual for plants. They grow with adding cells at their base. That's what's called a basal meristem. And as mentioned, hornworts have pockets in their thallus within which grow colonies of nitrogen-fixing blue-green bacteria. That's a really cool hornwort thing. And this is a fairly common hornwort. Also grows on natural situations with wet rocks and streams and shady ledges in the woods. This is one that's a little hard to recognize as a hornwort. This was seen at the edge of a soybean field in central Ohio, and it's called Nothothallus orbicularis. And it has sort of linear sporophytes, but they don't stand upright. They lay flat, kind of like a glove that fell on the ground. So here's a little sketch that I made that points out where the sporophytes are. It's growing with a couple mosses. But see, gametophyte, and then those finger-like projections are the sporophytes. And this is Nothothallus orbicularis. And it's the other fairly common hornwort, the other bryophytes. So if you want to learn about hornworts, there's a few books. Some of them are overwhelmingly technical, and one that I found useful is one that's kind of hard to obtain. It's published by Herbarium in Canada, and it's called An Enthusiast's Guide to the Liverworts and Hornworts of Ontario. And it's got nice diagrams and explanations about fairly common liverworts that you can recognize with just a hand lens, and you have to write to the herbarium in order to get it. Somewhat more technical, but not overwhelmingly so, but one that would assume having, say, a compound microscope, is a really good guide to the liverworts of North Carolina, and it's by Mary Hicks. And according to this Duke University website, it seems like it's out of stock, but maybe it's available from some other sources. So these are two useful books. And speaking of books, it appears as if I wrote one, which is called Common Mosses, Liverworts, and Lichens, Wholly Unrelated Organisms, but with Similar Ecology, of Ohio. This is a visual guide that's published by the Ohio University Press, and it's going to be available in late summer. So I'm very excited about seeing this book, and it's made for people interested in recognizing the really common species without technical language or much equipment, mostly with just a hand lens, mostly a photographic visual guide with some keys and illustrations. Looking forward to that. If you're interested in mosses and lichens, you should consider becoming associated with the best little nature club in Ohio. It's called the Ohio Moss and Lichen Association. We have a website. It's called ohiomosslichen.org. And we also go on field trips, forays. We have 2 forays every year, one in the spring/summer and one in the summer/fall. We also have an annual meeting and frequently volunteer our expertise at workshops and bio blitzes. And oh, by the way, if you're interested in photography and short descriptions of mosses and lichens, I have an Instagram feed. You can find it on the AMLA website, but you can also find me at Trematodon. And this is Instagram showing mostly mosses and lichens and liverworts, mostly photography. So thank you for your attention. I will close with an observation. You might have noticed that I didn't point out the economic or ecological importance of liverworts, and that's mainly because there isn't any, but that doesn't mean that they're not worthwhile, because heck, what joy they bring. So here's a little quotation from a liverwort book, an old liverwort book, and it says, "It is the office of the naturalist, no less than of the poet, to call attention to objects that are neglected because they are familiar or obscure, to show the beauty and the charm that lie hidden in common things, to give eyes where there have been no eyes, to dispel the lethargy of the mind, and to quicken the spirit to admiration and love. So thank you for your attention, and I hope you enjoy looking out for hornworts and other bryophytes. Stop recording.